My daughter called me a selfish miser over her $50,000 debt. She said it in front of 11 people. That is the number I keep returning to. Not the words themselves, though the words were precise enough to leave a mark. Not the way her voice climbed at the end of the sentence, cracking slightly the way it always did when she felt she was losing an argument and decided volume might substitute for reason. Not the way the room went still, the way rooms always go still when something irreversible is said out loud. 11 people. My neighbor Ruth, who had brought a lemon cake. My accountant Bernard, who had driven 40 minutes in traffic to be there. My oldest friend Sylvia, who had known me since we were both young women making our way in a world that did not particularly want to make room for us. My daughter's husband Gerald, who stood near the kitchen doorway with a glass of wine he had stopped pretending to drink. Two of my daughter's friends whose names I could never keep straight, though I had hosted them at my table more times than I could count. A young couple from down the street. My housekeeper Marta, who had paused in the hallway with a serving dish in her hands. And two of my former colleagues from the firm, women I had worked beside for the better part of 3 decades. 11 people who heard my 38-year-old daughter draw herself up to her full height in the dining room of my house, point one finger at me across the length of the table I had owned for 22 years, and say in a voice she clearly wanted to carry, "You are a selfish miser, mother. You always have been." The chandelier above the table threw its usual warm light. The centerpiece I had arranged that morning, white tulips, which I have always preferred to roses, sat undisturbed between us. My wine glass was half full. The remains of the dinner I had cooked because I still cooked. Because I was 73 and still capable of producing a meal that did not come out of a paper bag, were spread across the table between us. I did not move. I had learned long ago that stillness is its own form of power. I looked at my daughter, at Nadine, 38 years old, standing in the home I had built, wearing earrings I had given her for her 35th birthday, having eaten the food I had made, after spending the better part of the last hour asking me to give her $50,000, and I felt something settle in me. Not anger. Not grief. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those. A door closing. Not slamming. Just closing. The soft final click of a well-made door. My name is Miriam Voss. I am 73 years old, and for 41 years I ran a property consulting firm out of a third-floor office on Callaway Street in a mid-sized city that did not hand anything to women who showed up with ambition and no connections. I started with a borrowed desk, a used filing cabinet, a telephone, and one client. A retired pharmacist named Mr. Bellamy who wanted help negotiating a lease on a small commercial property, and who paid me $400 for 6 weeks of work. I was 32 years old. Nadine was not yet born. My husband, Thomas, was alive but struggling, in and out of employment, charming in the way that men who cannot hold a job are often charming, pleasant at parties, unreliable on every other occasion. I built Voss Property Consulting one client at a time. By the time Nadine was 3, I had 4 employees. By the time she started primary school, I had 11. By the time she graduated from the private secondary school I paid for, I had 26 employees, 3 office locations, and a client list that included 2 regional hospital networks, a national grocery chain, and a portfolio of residential developers who trusted me to tell them where to build and what it would cost. I worked mornings that started before 5. I worked evenings that ended after 10. I miss school plays. I miss sports days. I am not proud of that, and I do not offer it as virtue. I offer it as fact. I worked because the alternative was dependence, and I had seen what dependence did to a person. I had watched it do it to my own mother, and later in a different way to Thomas. Thomas died when Nadine was 14. A sudden cardiac event, fast and without warning, on a Tuesday morning in February while he was eating breakfast. I did not allow myself to grieve for longer than it took to arrange the funeral and notify the relevant people, because Nadine was 14 and frightened and needed a mother who was still standing, and because the firm needed someone at the helm, and because I had learned by then that grief, like everything else, had to be managed. I managed it. I kept the firm running. I kept Nadine in her school. I kept the house. I kept all of it together with both hands and sheer will, and I did not ask anyone to notice or to thank me, because I had not built anything I built in order to be thanked. I built it because it was mine. I want to be precise about what I gave Nadine because precision matters and because I am tired of the version of events that lives inside her head, The version in which I was withholding, distant, tight-fisted with my love and my money both. Here is the record. Secondary school at Hartwell Academy, which was not cheap and was not free and which Nadine attended from age 11 to age 18. $64,000 over 7 years, adjusted for annual fee increases. University tuition, for years at a good institution where she studied arts administration and graduated with a solid enough degree, and a social life that cost considerably more than the tuition itself. $41,000 in tuition, plus an additional $11,000 in supplementary living expenses I paid when her student allowance ran short, which it did consistently every single year. Her first apartment at 22 in a neighborhood she had decided was the right sort of neighborhood, which it was and which I paid for accordingly, 18 months of rent at $1,200 a month, because she had taken a position at a small arts nonprofit that paid her $31,000 a year and she could not bridge the gap herself. $21,600. A car at 24 because the city's public transit did not reach the new neighborhood she had moved to, which was a nicer neighborhood than the previous one and also somewhat further from her workplace. $14,500 for a reliable second-hand vehicle in good condition. Her credit card debt, cleared once at 26 when the balance had climbed to $9,800, the result of, as she explained it, an unexpected run of difficult months. I paid it without discussion. I did not ask for a detailed accounting of the difficult months. Her credit card debt, cleared a second time at 31 when the balance had climbed to $14,200. This time I asked one question. I asked whether she had considered speaking to a financial counselor. She said she had things under control. I wrote the check. A contribution of $20,000 toward her wedding at 33, which was a beautiful wedding at a vineyard venue she had selected, and which cost in total considerably more than $20,000. The remainder was covered, apparently, through a combination of Gerald's family's contribution and further debt that I did not learn about until much later. Gifts, over the course of 38 years, for birthdays and Christmases and graduations and housewarmings and no particular occasion at all. I stopped keeping a specific tally somewhere around the time she turned 30, but the total would not embarrass me if it were made public. $11,000 toward a business idea she had at 35. A small event planning consultancy she was convinced would be profitable and which, after 18 months, was not. I did not ask for the money back. Therapy, which I funded privately and without Nadine's knowledge for 3 years because she was struggling and because her health insurance at the time did not cover the therapist she had connected with, and because I was not going to let money be the reason my daughter did not get the help she needed. $140 a session weekly, for approximately 144 sessions. A little over $20,000. I am not reciting this list to congratulate myself. I am reciting it because when Nadine stood in my dining room and called me a selfish miser, I wanted to have the number clear in my own mind. The number, totaled conservatively and excluding the small daily kindnesses that do not have a dollar figure, was somewhere in the vicinity of $246,000. That is what a selfish miser had given one child over the course of a lifetime. She had called 3 days before to say she wanted to come to dinner. I said yes. I always said yes. She arrived with Gerald, who kissed me on the cheek and accepted a glass of wine and had the particular expression he always wore when he knew something was coming and wished it weren't. I had known Gerald for 5 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had married a woman with expensive habits and an unexamined belief that money would always arrive from somewhere, and he was beginning, I suspected, to understand the flaw in that arrangement. We ate. I had made a roast because Nadine had always loved a Sunday roast, and even now at 73, I could produce one worth eating. The conversation was general. The weather. A film Gerald had seen. A trip Nadine was considering. After dinner over coffee, Nadine said she needed to talk to me about something. I set my cup down. She explained that she and Gerald had found themselves in a difficult position financially. She used several soft words: challenging, stressful, temporary, restructuring, before arriving at the actual number. $50,000. She needed $50,000 to clear debts that had accumulated, as she described it, through a combination of factors outside their control. I asked what the debts consisted of. She listed some of them. A personal loan taken 3 years ago that they had been servicing but could no longer manage. Credit card balances across 3 cards. A payment plan for a procedure Gerald had needed that their insurance had only partially covered. I asked whether they had spoken to a financial advisor. She said they had looked into it. I asked what the advisor had said. She said they hadn't actually made an appointment yet, they just looked into it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told her, as clearly and as kindly as I knew how, that I would not be giving her $50,000. I told her that I loved her, that I had always loved her, that I would continue to love her, that I would help her find a financial counselor, sit with her at the appointment if she wanted me there, help her think through a plan, but that I would not write a check for $50,000 because I had written checks in the past and the checks had not changed the pattern, and I was 73 years old and I had worked for every cent I had, and I was not willing to watch it disappear again into a problem that had no bottom. She was quiet for a moment. Gerald was very still. Then she said, "You have the money, Mother." I said I was aware of that. She said, "You've always had the money. You just don't like spending it on other people." I said that was not an accurate characterization of my history. Her voice changed then. It rose. It took on the particular quality I had heard in it since she was a teenager, the quality that meant she had decided she was being wronged and had resolved to perform that wrongness loudly enough that it became true. She said that I had always held my money over her, that I had given her just enough to keep her grateful and not enough to make her free, that I sat in my house, which she said with a specific contempt, and accumulated and protected and controlled, and what was the point of it all if not to help my own daughter when she needed it? I said, "Nadine," she said, "you are a selfish miser, Mother. You always have been." 11 people heard it. I heard the sharp intake of breath from Sylvia, who had known me for 40 years and knew what those words would cost. I heard Ruth set her coffee cup down. I heard Marta very quietly move away down the hallway. Gerald put his hand on Nadine's arm. She shook it off. I looked at my daughter across the table I had owned for 22 years, in the house I had paid for, under the chandelier I had chosen, surrounded by people who had come to share an evening with me, and I understood something that I had been resisting understanding for a very long time. She did not see what I had given her. She saw only what I had not. And there was nothing, no check, no conversation, no amount of patience or generosity or love, that was going to change that, because the problem was not the $50,000. The problem was that she had come to believe somewhere along the way that I owed her. Not that I had given to her, but that I owed her. That what I had built was not mine but hers, waiting for me to finish with it and hand it over. She was 38 years old and she had been waiting her whole life for me to finish. I set my napkin on the table. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Nadine for a long moment and then I looked at Bernard, who had been my accountant for 19 years and who was sitting very straight in his chair with his hands folded on the table, and his expression carefully neutral. He caught my eye and gave the smallest possible nod, which meant he had heard everything and would remember it. I said, "I think we'll leave it here for the evening." I stood up. I thanked Ruth for the lemon cake. I thanked my former colleagues for making the drive. I said good night to the young couple from down the street. I was civil and I was composed and I did not look at Nadine again before I walked to the front door and held it open. They left. Gerald first, then Nadine, who paused in the doorway. She said, "You're going to think about it." It was not a question. I said, "Good night, Nadine." I closed the door. I stood in my front hallway for perhaps 30 seconds. The house was very quiet. The chandelier light from the dining room reached me faintly across the polished floor. My tulips were still white in their vase. The evening had been what it had been, and now it was over, and I was standing in my house at 73 years old with complete clarity about what I was going to do next. I walked to the kitchen. I filled the kettle. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room table, which still held the plates and glasses and the remains of the roast I had made for my ungrateful daughter, but the smaller kitchen table where I had eaten most of my solo breakfasts for the last 9 years, and I sat with the tea and with the quiet and with the thing that had been forming in my mind all evening. I had made a will. It was 12 years old. It required revision. I drank the tea. I thought about a dog named Copernicus. I found the Millbrook Animal Rescue 14 years ago, somewhat by accident. I had gone to a community fundraiser on behalf of a client, eaten a dry piece of chicken at a round table, and found myself, somewhat against my will, moved nearly to tears by a small 3-legged dog named Copernicus, who had climbed into my lap during the silent auction portion of the evening, and gone to sleep there. I did not take Copernicus home. My schedule did not accommodate a dog. But I wrote a check to Millbrook that evening for $3,000, which was more than I had intended to write, and I drove home thinking about the weight of him in my lap and the absolute trust with which he had simply assumed I was safe. Over the following 14 years, I had given Millbrook a total of $67,000 in donations, spread across annual contributions and 2 larger capital gifts. I had served on their fundraising advisory panel for 6 years. I had attended their annual events. I had walked dogs on Saturday mornings when my schedule permitted, which in the last 3 years since I had stepped back from daily operations at the firm, had been most Saturdays. The director of Millbrook was a woman named Helen, 61 years old, practical and warm in the particular way that people who work with animals often are, as though the daily proximity to creatures who cannot deceive you gradually removes the tolerance for human deception as well. Helen and I had what I would describe as a genuine friendship, built over 14 years of shared purpose. I thought about Helen. I thought about the shelter's expansion campaign, the new wing they needed, the kennels that would allow them to take in 40% more animals, the funding gap they had been working to close for 2 years. I called Bernard at 10 minutes past 9. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting for me to call. I said, "I need to make some changes." He said, "I know." I said, "I want to start with the will." He said he had been thinking the same thing and had taken the liberty of drafting some preliminary notes on his phone during dinner, which was why, I now understood, he had been looking at his phone when I thought he was checking messages. I said, "Can you call Patricia?" Patricia Horn was my attorney, 67 years old, whom I had worked with for 22 years and who had the admirable quality of being entirely unsurprised by anything clients asked her to do. Bernard said he would call her now. I said, "Tell her I want everything ready by morning." She said, through Bernard who relayed it, that she would need coffee and her reading glasses, but yes. By 9 p.m., Bernard had reached Patricia, and Patricia had opened her laptop at her kitchen table. The initial call between the 3 of us lasted 47 minutes. Patricia took notes. I spoke clearly and without hesitation. Bernard confirmed figures as needed from the records he carried in his head after 19 years of managing my accounts. The primary change was this. Nadine, who had been named as the sole beneficiary of my estate, would be removed entirely. By 11 p.m., Patricia had pulled the current will and the trust documentation and had begun drafting the amendment. The estate was not simple. 41 years of work had produced an asset base that required careful handling, but it was well organized because I had always insisted on organization. The house, the investment portfolio, my remaining equity in the firm, which I had partially sold but not entirely, a collection of commercial property holdings I had retained as a pension, the contents of 3 accounts, 2 of them substantial. The new primary beneficiary would be the Millbrook Animal Rescue, specifically designated for the construction of the new wing. The gift was structured as a conditional bequest. It would fund the expansion, and the wing would carry a name of the shelter's choosing. I did not ask for my name on it. I did not need my name on things. By 1 a.m., Patricia had drafted the main amendment and emailed it to me and Bernard for review. We read it. Bernard noted 3 small points of clarification. Patricia revised them. I approved the revised version at 1:47 a.m. By 3 a.m., the trust restructuring was underway. My estate trust had named Nadine as contingent beneficiary across several instruments. Each of those designations was being revised. Bernard had the account numbers. Patricia had the forms. The changes were prepared for execution first thing in the morning when institutions opened. By 5 a.m., the investment account beneficiary designations had been prepared for update. These required submission directly to the financial institutions, which could not be done until business hours, but the paperwork was ready, signed, dated, witnessed by Bernard, who had driven to my house at midnight and sat with me at the kitchen table through the rest of the night with his reading glasses and his laptop and the quiet competence of a man who has spent 19 years making sure things are done correctly. By 7 a.m., the final document, a letter of instruction to my executor, outlining my wishes in plain language in addition to the legal language of the formal instruments, was complete. I read it twice. I signed it. Bernard witnessed it. Patricia, on the telephone, confirmed that everything was in order, and that she would file and register the will amendment when the relevant offices opened at 9. I made Bernard toast and tea. We sat in my kitchen in the early morning light and did not speak very much, because there was not very much left to say. He asked once whether I was certain. I told him I had never been more certain of anything. He nodded and ate his toast. At 9:13 in the morning, Nadine called me. I know the precise time because I was looking at the clock on the kitchen wall when the phone rang, and the clock on my kitchen wall has told accurate time for 11 years and I have no reason to doubt it. I did not answer. She called again at 9:15, and at 9:18, and at 9:22, at which point she stopped calling and began leaving voicemails, which I listened to later in sequence with my tea. The first voicemail was relatively measured. She had spoken to Gerald. She had thought about the conversation. She wanted to talk. The second voicemail was less measured. She had received something in the mail. She didn't understand it. She needed to speak with me. The third voicemail had abandoned measure entirely. Her voice was high and tight and airless, the voice of a person who had just understood something that they could not ununderstand. She said she had received a letter from Patricia Horn's office. She said she needed to talk to me immediately. The letter from Patricia's office was a formal notification, sent by certified mail and also by email, informing Nadine that she had been removed as a beneficiary from my estate, and that the relevant trust and will instruments had been amended accordingly. It was written in the precise, courteous, completely implacable language that Patricia always used, which was one of the reasons I had worked with Patricia for 22 years. The letter named no reason. Patricia had advised against naming reasons. The law did not require reasons. I did not offer them. By 9:31, Nadine had called Patricia's office. I know this because Patricia's assistant called me at 9:34 to let me know, as per my standing instruction, that Patricia notify me of any contact from Nadine. The assistant said that Nadine had been, in her words, extremely distressed, and that Patricia had spoken with her briefly and confirmed that the changes were legal, binding and final, and that there was no error. By 9:45 Gerald called me. He was calmer than Nadine, or at least more practiced at sounding calm. He asked if we could speak. I said this was not a conversation I was prepared to have. He said he understood and then said he wasn't sure he did understand, and I told him that was fine too. By 10:30, Nadine had driven to my house. I watched from the upstairs window as she parked and sat in the car for several minutes before getting out. She rang the bell. I did not answer. She rang it again. She knocked. She said my name through the door, once and then again, and then a third time in a voice that had lost all of its hardness and was simply the voice of a woman who had just had the floor removed from under her. I did not open the door. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. There was nothing to say that had not already been said, in the most precise language available to me, in the documents that Patricia had filed that morning. She sat on my front step for 20 minutes. Then she got back in her car and drove away. The estate she had expected to inherit was valued, at current assessment, at approximately $2.3 million. It included the house, which I owned outright, assessed at $640,000. The investment portfolio, which Bernard managed with his customary precision, stood at $812,000. The retained commercial properties generated annual income and were valued collectively at approximately $610,000. The firm equity remaining in my name had a current buyout value of around $240,000. She had stood in my dining room in front of 11 people and called me a selfish miser. $2.3 million. That was what she had called miserly. 6 months is not a long time. It is long enough. I did not seek out information about Nadine's circumstances in the months that followed. I did not ask mutual acquaintances for reports. What I know came to me through ordinary channels, through Sylvia, who mentioned things because Sylvia and I had been friends for 40 years and she believed correctly that I could hear difficult news without requiring protection from it. Nadine and Gerald had separated. This did not surprise me. A marriage that had been built partly on the anticipation of an inheritance could not comfortably survive the removal of that inheritance, particularly when the debts remained and no external solution had arrived. Nadine had taken a position as an office administrator at a small creative agency. The salary was adequate. It was not the salary of a person who expected to inherit $2.3 million, but it was a salary, and it appeared to be earned by work that was actually performed. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building on the east side of the city. Sylvia had driven past it. She said it was clean. She said the street was fine. Nadine drove the car she had bought herself 3 years ago, which she was still paying off. She did not contact me. I did not contact her. What I felt in those 6 months was not satisfaction. I want to be precise about this. It was not satisfaction because there was nothing satisfying about any of it. Not the evening it began, not the night I spent revising the documents, not the morning she found out, not the separation, not the apartment on the east side of the city. None of it was satisfying. I wore a blue coat I had bought the previous autumn and had not yet had occasion to wear. Bernard was beside me because Bernard was almost always beside me when things mattered. Patricia had sent flowers. Ruth had come and Sylvia and 2 of my former colleagues. There were dogs because of course there were dogs. A litter of 4 small mixed-breed puppies that Helen had allowed out into the outdoor area for the occasion, tumbling over each other with the absolute physical joy of creatures who have not yet learned to moderate their happiness. 2 older dogs moved more slowly along the fence line, amiable and calm. A young volunteer, perhaps 19, held a 3rd dog on a lead, a large copper-colored animal with 1 torn ear who had arrived at the shelter 10 days earlier and was doing, Helen said, remarkably well. I watched the puppies for a while. I watched the copper-colored dog sit down beside the young volunteer and lean his full weight against her leg, and the young volunteer reach down without looking and rest her hand on his head, and the dog close his eyes. I thought about Copernicus, who had died at the age of 11, 4 years after I first met him. I thought about the weight of him in my lap at that fundraising dinner, the absolute trust of a creature who simply assumed without evidence that you were safe. I thought about Nadine briefly, in the way that I had learned to think about her. Not with anger, not with grief in its acute form, but with the quiet recognition of a thing that had gone the way it had gone. I thought about the 41 years I had spent building something, and the 14 years I had spent walking into this particular shelter on Saturday mornings, and the way those 2 things had turned out to be connected in a way I had not anticipated but perhaps should have. Helen made a short speech. She said the Voss wing would serve animals in need for decades to come, and that it existed because of the sustained and genuine generosity of a woman who had never made generosity a performance. I found that accurate. Bernard handed me a coffee in a paper cup from the table near the entrance. It was not very good coffee. I drank it anyway. I am 73 years old. I have built things that will outlast me, and I have given things that were not appreciated, and I have learned the difference between the 2 late enough that the lesson cost something but early enough that I could still act on it. Here is what I know about love and money and the people we raise. A gift given freely is not a debt owed in return. What you pour into another person's life does not belong to them as a right. It belongs to the giving, to the choice, to the hand that opened. The hand that closes is not cruelty. It is memory. We do not owe our children an inheritance. We owe them our best effort while we are here to give it. What remains when we are finished belongs to whatever we decide it belongs to because we built it and the builder sets the terms. A 73-year-old woman lying on the floor of the life she built should not stay on the floor. She should stand up, smooth her coat and decide in the quiet of her own house what happens next. I decided. And on a Thursday morning in spring, standing in the thin sunlight outside a shelter full of dogs that nobody had wanted, watching a copper-colored animal lean his whole weight against a young woman who had not yet learned to doubt that she was safe, I understood that I had decided correctly. My name is Miriam Voss. I am 73 years old. I am still the one who decides.